Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome somebody else playing, maybe? Folks, if we get anybody who has gotten on the line, I'd ask that you either step off the actual phone call or please mute your phone lines. All right, we'll get started here. Hopefully the audio is coming through now good. I guess if a couple folks could give us a little in the chat box, let us know if the audio sounds fine. So good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our January webinar for the Lake States Fire Science Consortium. I'm Jack McGowan-Stinsky, and I'll be moderating the webinar this afternoon. For those who may be joining us for the first time, let me give you a little background. We are funded by the Joint Fire Science Program and are one of 15 regional consortia for fire science students across the country. Our mission is to accelerate the awareness, understanding, adoption, and sharing of wildland fire science information by federal, tribal, state, local, and private stakeholders across the Lake States and the adjacent Canadian provinces of Ontario and Manitoba. We strive to be inclusive and neutral science partners working to foster collaboration among researchers and practitioners and organizations and individuals, and by developing innovative approaches to science delivery while facilitating dialogue about new science findings and emerging needs. Before we get started, let's take a few seconds and look at our Adobe Connect webinar interface. To ask a question or interact with the attendees, please use the chat box located in the lower right-hand portion of your screen. Once you type your question, make sure you click the send button. We'll be monitoring these questions and we'll make sure that there's an opportunity to address them. If you'd like to learn more about the consortium and what we're doing, please visit our website at lakestatesfireside.net, and please sign up to receive our newsletters and announcements of other activities. It looks like we had a couple people that have joined on the phone. If you could either step off the phone line or mute your phones, it would be much appreciated. Okay, so we'll continue here. So let's get on today's webinar. We're going to be talking about Aspen and Fire in the Lake States by Lee Frelich. Lee is the director of the University of Minnesota Center for Forest Ecology. Lee received a PhD in forest ecology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1986. He teaches courses in forest fire ecology and landscape ecology on the St. Paul campus and has advised 24 graduate students. Lee has authored more than 150 publications with 180 co-authors from 23 countries, including major works for Cambridge University Press and Oxford University Press. He is listed among the top 1% of all scientists in the world in the Thomson Reuters Web of Science, Ecology, and Environment category. Research has been featured in the news media over 450 times, including such venues as New York Times, Newsweek, CBS Radio, Osgood Files, and National Geographic. Lee has provided consulting services in forest management for many government agencies, including the U.S. Army, the Air Force, the U.S. Forest Service, the National Park Service, and Departments of Natural Resources in several states. Current research interests include large-scale fire and wind, earthworm invasion, effects of deer and moose browsing, and climate change. So with that, let's get to the webinar. Take it away, Lee.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. I'm at my office in St. Paul, and Jack is somewhere in Michigan. So anyway, I'm going to talk about aspen and fire, and I'll give you some new results that we have coming from northern Minnesota, but I also have some summary of some of the older things. So let's move in here. So I'll show you how aspen forests fit into the landscape mosaic created by disturbance in northern hardwoods and mixed pine and boreal forests, and then we'll move on to look at what causes dominance by aspen versus paper birch. A lot of times aspen and birch are lumped together as an aspen-birch forest type, and in fact they often are mixed together, but there are various factors that can cause one or the other to be the dominant species. We'll look a little bit at the future with a warmer climate and what invasive species might mean for the future of aspen as well. So just a little bit of background information here. The range for quaking aspen, it goes all the way from the high Arctic, getting almost up to the shore of the Arctic Ocean, all the way across the continent, the high altitudes in the mountains and in the lake states. It grows in the boreal forest in the very northern part, and also in the northern hardwoods, and also in with oaks in kind of an aspen oak mixture. And it even occurs within ravines and north slopes and so on in the prairie areas of Iowa and northern Illinois and southwestern Minnesota. So it gets into some warmer climates here than it does in the rest of its range. And here's the current abundance based on the forest inventory analysis from the Climate and Tree Atlas. And the dark green and blue areas are where it's most abundant. And it's over 30% abundance in most of northern Minnesota and a fair amount of northern Wisconsin and northern lower Michigan and upper Michigan. Big tooth aspen is also included here. Has a much more limited range. It grows in the southern boreal and the northern temperate forest. It can't conveniently be classified as either boreal or temperate, but does get into some warmer climates down in places like Kentucky. My experience is it tends to prefer the richer soils, so not as much on bedrocks like granite as it would be on, say, gabbro or basalt. So it depends a lot on the type of glacial drift you have in the mineral content, and not as abundant as quaking aspen, but pretty abundant though in the northern part of lower Michigan and in some scattered parts of Wisconsin. I'm not going to cover the third aspen species, the balsam poplar, which is a really odd species, grows in swamps and also on rock outcrops and sand dunes, but it's only really abundant in the central part of northern Minnesota, and I don't understand it very much, so I won't say a lot about balsam poplar. So what about the role of aspen in the northern hardwood mosaic? This is a picture at Lake of the Clouds Overlook in the Porcupine Mountains in upper Michigan, and that the blue oval there, right in this area, actually outlines an area of aspen forest in what otherwise is mostly a sugar maple and hemlock dominated landscape mosaic. And what happened in that particular place on that hill was a blowdown windstorm with a downburst that leveled most of the timber, followed by a fire a few years later. And the regeneration came back to aspen with some paper birch in it. And so that's basically how aspen establishes its niche in these northern hardwood landscapes. I mean, most of the disturbance in northern hardwood landscapes is not stand leveling. It's mostly formation of small and medium-sized gaps like you see here. And there just isn't enough light in those gaps for aspen. Sometimes you can get mid-tolerant things like yellow birch and red maple in those gaps, but not aspen. We have seen some instances like shown in this picture here, where there's some paper birch and aspen that's only 60 years old under some hemlocks and maples that are at least twice that age and caused by spot fires, where lightning strikes a tree and kind of burns a tenth of an acre to an acre or something like that before the rain from the thunderstorm puts it out. So you can get these odd mixtures of early successional things and late successional trees that weren't killed by the fire. However, the major occurrence of aspen is when you get the blowdown of the northern hardwood forest followed by a fire in the windfall slash, and then you can get the pure stands of quaking aspen and paper birch, usually with a little bit of big tooth aspen mixed. And then that will succeed back to maple and hemlock over a period of a couple hundred years if the seed source is available. So that's really the way aspen works on that landscape. So looking here, you can see the blowdown. Let me see the pointer here. And then that slash can burn. You can never really get a fire that's intense enough to regenerate aspen outside of having that windfall slash in this forest type, and then you undergo succession and get back to old multi-age hemlock and maple stands. So the cycle can be short-circuited, it can blow down and not burn, and just undergo development without any succession, even age stand growing back to a multi-age stand, but late successional species through the whole cycle, or the blowdown can burn and end up being aspen and birch mixture. So that niche varied in size depending exactly where on the landscape of the lake states. As you go further south, say southern Wisconsin, the southern part of lower Michigan, those blowdowns occurred more often and were bigger, and the percent of the landscape that might be birch and aspen could be as high as 10 to 20%. And then when you go up into the far north in upper Michigan, for example, the Porcupine Mountains that I studied for my PhD, you only expect the percent birch and aspen to be 1 or 2% of the whole landscape, because those big blowdowns and the chances of fire are just more rare at those latitudes. One interesting thing, though, is that combination of disturbances that's severe enough to wipe out the northern hardwoods and hemlock wasn't very common in the vegetation before European settlement. As you can see in the upper map there, that's the pre-European settlement map of the vegetation of the 3 lake states here. And the green is the northern hardwood and hemlock type. The orange are the pine forests. The gold colors are the oak and oak savannas. And then there's some brown, which is peatland and boreal forests. But if you look at the map, the lower map, which is the modern composition of the forest, there's a lot more yellow, which is the aspen and birch forest type. And basically what the settlers did is cut down the forest and then burn the slash, and so they replicated what was a very rare combination of disturbances under the natural disturbance regime, but they made it widespread across the entire landscape so that the birch and aspen forest type became way more common after settlement. But that's a one-time event on the landscape. We're not going to clear cut the whole landscape all at the same time and burn it again. So now a lot of those aspen forests are succeeding back to northern hardwoods, or back to red maple, or to oak or balsam fir, depending on the soils and climate of a given area. And here's an example of an old birch and aspen forest this is on the north shore of Lake Superior in Minnesota. And look at this older stand, and the red that you see in the understory there is actually red maple that's invaded the understory. So if this is harvested in the winter without any scarification, or if it blows down in a windstorm, it's not going to remain birch and aspen. It's going to be pushed forward in succession to the maple. So it would be an example of disturbance-mediated accelerated succession if that were to happen. So that's where it fits into the northern hardwoods, where it fits into the pine, the mixed pine, the red and white pine that we have in the lake states, is the next topic. This is a picture from the Boundary Waters, and it's a multi-aged white pine stand with a few red pines in it. There are pines in there anywhere from 100 years old to 400 years old. So if here's the pointer. So looking here, these are about 100-year-old pines, or 200-year-old pines here, and 300 to 400-year-old pines over here. So very much a mixed age. Fires are more frequent, but they kill a smaller percent of stand than you would have in a crown fire in the boreal jack pine and black spruce forest. And birch and aspen do come in when you get these disturbances that kill maybe 20 to 50% of the stand. So they're multi-cohort stands, but there can be birch and aspen coming in, and sometimes there will be a crown fire as well. It's what we call a mixed fire regime. So sometimes there will be a crown fire. They're not as extensive as they are in the boreal forest, but they can cover a few hundred acres to a few thousand acres. And aspen will come in after that, usually mixed with birch, and then there's three options basically. White pine will start to reinvade. It's shade toler enough to grow under the aspen. If there's no fire, then the aspen will be replaced by the pine, and then the pine eventually by maple or hemlock or spruce fir, depending on the climate where you happen to be. If there are low-intensity surface fires, then it might just succeed to an uneven-aged pine with scattered occurrences of birch and aspen mixed in. Or if there's another high-intensity fire, then it goes back to the dense young birch and aspen. And that situation was more likely to happen in northwestern Minnesota or in central Minnesota, central Wisconsin, central Michigan, where you have the sandy soils in the warmer, relatively warmer summers than in the boreal region, where you'd get the fires would come at a higher frequency and you could maintain large acreages of the young, even-age aspen, and it wouldn't really be allowed to undergo succession to pine and then back to oak or northern hardwoods or boreal forest. But birch and aspen also played a significant role in the multi-aged pine forest in cases where there wasn't a crown fire. As you see here, the birch and aspen in the background of the picture in the lower left, where a fire had come 9 years earlier and killed a group of the large pine trees. And you see regeneration of pine there and birch and aspen. So it's not unusual to have these small patches of birch and aspen mixed within those forests. And sometimes when there's a high intensity fire like burned the forest in this picture, I do expect that birch and aspen will invade. This is only a few months after a fire. This is from the Pagami Creek fire, which was in September of 2011 in northern Minnesota. And the odd thing about this picture is the duff is thicker after the fire than it was before, because it was a high-intensity surface fire and the rising hot air killed all the foliage in the tops of the pines, and then that came back down onto the forest floor. So obviously this would restrict the germination of aspen, but if there are just a few aspen trees in the stand, even if they were top-killed, the root sprouts could be, and in fact have been, very prolific. I don't have a picture of this stand a few years later, but there is aspen scattered throughout the stand from root sprouts. And aspen stands are commonly, as I said, reinvaded by later successional species, and usually those come from refuges, which could be along rivers or lakes. It's really common to have a few pines or a few firs survive at the edge of a lake or river. And then there's kind of a wave of succession. And this illustrates the case for balsam fir surviving at the edge of a lake. And you get a wave, so as you get further and further away from that surviving fir, the understory fir underneath the aspen is younger and younger. So this was a really common situation a few decades ago, and now, of course, a lot of these stands have grown to the point where the fir is mature all across the landscape, which makes an aspen forest then ripe for a high-intensity fire. If you've got 50% fir in there, you can have a high-intensity crown fire, whereas the aspen forest by itself is only going to support generally a surface fire. And then whether or not each tree is girdled by the fire would depend on its bark thickness if it's a surface fire, so you could get patchy mortality. And of course, if red maple is what mixes in rather than fir, that's not going to support the crown fire either. for those stands further south, or actually these days red maple is all over in the boundary waters according to our latest survey. So the boundary waters is going to be like central Minnesota and Wisconsin used to be in just a decade or two. So now let's look at the boreal forest that formerly had the great big fires. These are some of Heinzelman's fire maps from the boundary waters showing 400,000 acres burned there in the 1863 and 1864 fire, and a couple 100,000 acres burned in 1875. So this is the area with boreal forest, jack pine, black spruce, big crown fires, high intensity, large spatial extent. And this is what they look like. And so what's the role of aspen on this landscape? And before European settlement, aspen was relegated to a small proportion of the landscape in terms of high levels of dominance, probably about 10 or 20%. The conifer regeneration is very dense and, of course, casts a lot of shade, so that's a lot of competition for the aspen. You see here even-aged jack pine in the upper picture is about 17 years old. Even though it's growing on a slab of granite, it's really dense. It'd be really hard for aspen to grow there in much abundance. However, there were cases where 2 fires burned in a short time. Looking at the map here, the 1864 fire is in one type of cross-hatching, and the 1875 fire is cross-hatching the other direction, and the black shows the overlap. So that big area there kind of in the east-central part of the boundary waters was burned in both fires. At the time of the second fire, the pine was not old enough to bear large numbers of seeds, and so it was greatly reduced or even locally exterminated by the second fire, and aspen came back in. So there were always a few scattered aspen, and they root sprouted, but a lot of aspen would have come in from seed, the seeds being able to travel many miles and find these newly burned areas that don't have any conifer competition. So that black area there had a very high dominance of aspen that lasted right up into the 1970s at the time Heinzelman did his work in the boundary waters. So that's how it fit in that mosaic. A little bit of aspen everywhere, and dominance of aspen on a small proportion of the landscape that by chance was burned twice in a short time. So looking at Heinzelman's work, burning at 20 to 150 year intervals gives you the jack pine and black spruce. If there's no fire for 150 years, it succeeds to spruce and fir and birch. Surprisingly, birch can become a late successional species in those stands by invading tree gaps, as well as being a pioneer species coming in right after big fires along with aspen. And then there are those places that by chance burn twice in less than 20 years, and aspen really dominates those, although birch is in the mixture. So that's how it fits into those. Now let me show a little bit from the more recent disturbances. We had the big blowdown in the boundary waters of 1999. That's the brown shading there. About a 40-mile swath, 10 to 15 miles wide, was leveled by that windstorm on the 4th of July in 1999. And then the kind of orange and pink shaded polygons there are fires that occurred afterwards. So this gives us a chance to see what happens when you have wind followed by fire, what happens when one area burns in more than one fire in a short time. And we were able to observe by having plots on the ground. So my PhD student, Eli Anoszko, who's shown there, who's going to graduate with a PhD, we hope, in the next month or two. He's written his papers, but had 850 plots distributed throughout this area. So every combination of disturbance you can think of blowdown only, fire only, blowdown plus prescribed fire, blowdown plus wildfire in the spring, blowdown plus wildfire in the fall, and so on. And at the Ecological Society of America meeting in 2014, I presented some of these early results, and according to the Twitter traffic, we won the sample-size smackdown among the scientists because we had more plots than the other forest ecologists who presented their work. So 850 is a lot of plots. And so here's a picture before and after the big blowdown. There was a lot of aspen in the forest right in this particular picture, mixed with paper birch, and you can see on the right it's all flattened, aspen being one of the most susceptible species to blow down. Wind is really it's selective weeding of the forest. Certain species of trees are more likely to blow down, and let me show you what that means for aspen here. So these are the mortality curves by diameter. So if you look across this graph here, you have diameter trees from 7 centimeters to about 50 centimeters. And then the mortality rates for areas that were hit by moderately high wind for this particular storm. And you'll notice that there's a group of species here that had low mortality across all sizes. Then there are 2 species that had high mortality across all sizes of trees, and one of those is aspen. This one is aspen, and the other here is jack pine. So aspen is one of the most susceptible trees to wind compared to the other species. That's probably because it's an early successional species. The wood is not very strong compared to late successional species. It tends to be a fairly tall tree, so the crown is up there in the high enough above the ground to experience high winds. A lot of aspens have cankers as well, and they tend to break off where those cankers formed. Or if they're growing on shallow to bedrock soils, they can uproot as well. So high mortality rates for aspen in the windstorm. So those aspen stands that had formed during that event where it burned twice in the 1860s and 1870s, that aspen blew down, and what happened to it is it transitioned to lots of different stand types. So this is an ordination, which has about 700 of our 850 plots in it, and you can see here on the right side, it's grouped by composition. So plots that are next to each other have similar composition. Plots that are far away are different. So these are aspen stands, balsam fir dominated stands, black spruce dominated stands, paper birch, and cedar dominated stands fall in different parts of the ordination. While the plot on the left shows what happened to those aspen stands after the windstorm. So the aspen stands all originated in this area here, and these little arrows show the trajectory, so before the storm and after the storm, and you can see they transitioned all over the place in composition. Some of them became black spruce stands, some became balsam fir stands, some became cedar stands, and so on. The reason for that is those species are shade tolerant, and they were in the understory, so the aspen blew down and could release an entire understory of spruce or fir or cedar. And in some cases, they became the ones that went right in here. They became birch-dominated stands, and that would be because birch has a very small mortality rate compared to aspen. So in mixed birch-aspen stands, the aspen were way more likely. If 10 or 20% of the old birch blew down, it would be 50 or 60% or 70% of the older aspen. So by differential mortality or by releasing understories of really varied species composition, aspen stands transition to many different types of stand as a result of that windstorm. And here's some pictures after the blowdown. It's still quite green. I mean, the big pines are gone, the big aspens are gone, and if you look here, you see a paper birch that's still standing. So paper birch was one of those species that was very resistant to wind. And there's a lot of small spruce here and small cedars that didn't blow down, but the big aspen are all laying down on the ground down in the brush there. And then, of course, whoops, this is where I put the slides kind of in the wrong order. I meant to put this slide first. So showing the old forest just before the blowdown, big pines, there are some big old birches and aspens in there, really dense understories of spruce and fir and cedar. Then it blew down, the picture on the right. So that picture on the right is now on the left on this slide. And then a lot of those burned, as you see in the picture on the right in this slide. So let me skip ahead here. And those burn stands then came back to various mixtures of birch and aspen. You can see in this particular stand right here, it's almost all birch. It's probably 90% birch, but in other cases it came back to 80 or 90% aspen. So old boreal forest blowing down, the aspen stands that did exist transitioned to all different young types like spruce or fir or cedar. The stands that burned then came back to birch and aspen. So here's a summary of the successional pathways. The classic work of Heinzelman is this, and starting out with aspen stands or jack pine stands, they mostly had parallel successional pathways. If an aspen stand burned, it would come back as aspen, although sometimes, like I said earlier, if a jack pine stand burned twice in a short time, it would transition to aspen. But mostly the same thing that burned coming back, and just a little bit of crossing of the successional pathways. With wind, you have divergence. So if you started with aspen, you could diverge to fir stands, spruce stands, birch stands, or cedar stands. That's also true of jack pine. They had very divergent successional pathways. But when there was wind followed by fire, which is this third column here, no matter what you started with, it converged to birch and aspen. Because the filter there, having the pines blow down on the ground and then having those burn, for one thing, the pine cones are down on the ground, so they're in the flames way longer than they would be up in the crown. And for another thing, if the fire came 5 or 6 years later, the viability of the pine seeds is much lower. It goes steadily down. Some of the seeds will survive 9 or 10 years for jack pine, but the number of viable seeds goes steadily down once those trees are on the ground. So birch and aspen kind of win by default. So these are the alternate states in the boreal forest. So late succession, let me put the pointer on here, late succession, spruce, fir, birch, and cedar, which can only be maintained by low severity disturbance, which would be tree fall gaps. But if there's a crown fire, jack pine would be the expected species. If there's 2 fires in a short time, which is a very high cumulative disturbance severity in a short time, then you get aspen. So aspen is growing on the most severely disturbed sites with the double whammy of either 2 fires in a short time or wind throw followed by fire. That would regenerate aspen. But what about the birch versus aspen aspect of this? I told you at the beginning I would cover that. So I've got 2 case studies here. One is the Cavity Lake Fire of July 2006. And this is its progression map. So it started right here. Each day is a different color. So the dark purple the first day, the lighter purple the second day, the brown the third day, and red the fourth day, and so on. So it was in the blowdown. It was midsummer. It was during a severe drought, so an extremely high severity fire. And this is my former grad student and postdoc Roy Rich trying to escape the fire. He was doing field work there, and the Forest Service said everything would be fine, but the fire blew up and spread faster than expected. And very high intensity, 150 foot flame lengths, long duration because of the windfall slash on the forest floor. And this is the aftermath. A lot of places were burned down to bedrock, as you can see in the picture on the left. And even in places where it was a surface fire, as you can see on the picture on the right, with that 200-year-old red pine killed because the flame lengths were probably 10 to 15 feet, and that was putting enough heat up into the atmosphere to completely scorch the foliage up to heights of 90 or 100 feet. So even the tallest pines were killed. But this is 5 years later, and there's a lot of birch here, but there's still some aspen, but it's mostly birch. Now let me show you the other case study, which is the Ham Lake fire. And that was the following year, 2007. It was lit right here as an escape campfire at a drive-in campground. And then again, each day is a different color. So first day is the magenta, the second day is the dark blue, and so on. And I happened to be out in this, almost in the fire. I was camping here on 3 Mile Island and managed to make a getaway when I saw the fire was headed straight toward me, or me and my two friends, and we ended up here on the north, stuck for 3 days on the north shore of Seagull Lake because the waves were too big. And it was May, it was a spring fire, only 3 days after ice out. The water was 35 degrees, and it was windy, so we weren't willing to chance capsizing, so we were stuck there for 3 days and then finally got out. So the fire burned through the Canadian border here up into Canada, and then the wind direction changed and it came back across the Canadian border, almost hit the command center, which had to move, and came back down across the Gunflint Trail here in the United States again. So this is our campsite at midnight, even a couple miles away here. It was light enough that you didn't really need headlamps or anything. So spring fire, not burning as deeply into the duff, and that has some, because that was still wet. The snow had just melted a week earlier. That really has some important implications for birch versus aspen. And you can see here the heterogeneity of the Ham Lake burn. There are live trees. There are trees that were scorched by radiant heat, but the foliage is dead, and then there are trees that where the fire crowned out that were killed by direct contact with flames. And here's regeneration, and you see a lot of aspen there rather than a lot of birch. I mean, in both cases, Cavity Lake and Ham Lake, there's birch and aspen mixed together, but for Cavity Lake it was mostly birch, and for Ham Lake it was mostly aspen. And I think what's going on there is that the season of fire makes a big difference. After spring fires, which don't burn deeply into the duff, a lot of the aspen root systems are still intact and were therefore able to do a lot of root sprouting. And after the midsummer or fall fires, we also had some other cases in addition to Cavity Lake that were September fires. They burned deeply into the duff. They may have killed a lot of the potential root sprouting parts of the root system of the aspen trees. And then the other thing is the matchup with the seed, the time at which the seeds are dispersed. So for aspen, not only does more of the root system survive, with a spring fire gets a little bit of a heat pulse, which stimulates it to sprout, and it gets rid of the competing vegetation, the shrubs and the balsam fir seedlings. But aspen seeds are also spread in the spring, and we had both root sprouting and new germination of aspen. And the midsummer and fall fires prepared a perfect seedbed for birch seeds, which are shed in September. And so we got massive germination of birch in midsummer or fall fires. So going a little bit into the future here, what I see for aspen, one, vast acreages of boreal conifer forest is going to die. And initially, I think it's going to be invaded by aspen. I mean, as the climate has warmed, we've progressively seen more and more aspen and birch replacement after fires as compared to conifers. And of course, further south, this is already common because, you know, northern lower Michigan and northern Wisconsin, it's been warm enough all along that there never was much boreal regeneration in the last several decades. So up in the boreal forest, I think the boreal conifers will die just due to heat stress and drought and initially be invaded by aspen, which has a little bit bigger tolerance for warmer climates. But that might be short-lived, that round of aspen dominance, because eventually the droughts will get severe enough to affect aspen. So this is from the Climate and Tree Aspen, Atlas that shows aspen as of 2010 in the upper picture, and that's the same one I showed earlier showing the high abundance of aspen in the northern parts of the lake states. And then a projection for a business-as-usual climate scenario for the year 2100 showing a much reduced abundance of aspen. And I think a lot of sites, the sandy sites, the shallow to bedrock sites, will become too droughty for aspen, and so oak will be favored further south. And even in the boundary waters, I think maple and oak will start to be favored over aspen, although it'll still be in the mix along with red maple and oak. In addition to that, we think the number of severe storms will go up. Even in northern Minnesota in the boreal forest, this shows derecho frequency, and there's a pretty strong south to north gradient. So those parts of the northern lake states like upper Michigan and northern Minnesota and northern lower Michigan that have a lower frequency of severe thunderstorms and downburst winds, that will probably go up in a warmer climate, and that has implications for aspen because, as I said earlier, aspen is one of the most susceptible trees to wind throw. And oftentimes there are late successional species like red maple or sugar maple or hemlock or balsam fir, depending on where you are underneath. So aspen stands might not fare very well. And then there'll be more opportunities for these wind plus fire disturbance events where there's windfall slash that burns in an uncontrollable high-intensity fire. And with the size of some of these blowdowns, we probably won't get it all salvaged. So the wind plus fire might allow transition initially to aspen, but then later on to red maple and oak. So I think we'll get a lot of these young aspen stands in the early stages of global warming. And then as those grow up, they'll either be replaced by red maple and oak or they'll blow down. So they'll either have gradual replacement or sudden replacement depending on whether they blow down. And again, to bring this picture back showing the red maple in the understory, which is already everywhere in the boundary waters. The red maple seedlings are pretty much ubiquitous throughout the boundary waters, so this transformation initially to aspen and then later to red maple and oak is already underway. The other thing that I mentioned a minute ago for aspen is drought. So we expect the intensity of drought to go up with a warmer climate. So these two maps here compare drought intensity now on average. So let me put the pointer on here. So you see the lake states here are in the green shading, which is not a negative Palmer drought severity index for an average summer. But comparing that to what the climate will be for the lake states by the middle or end of this century. Basically, we're talking about the level of drought stress you would have in Kansas or Iowa, which when you move that level of drought stress to the northern parts of the lake states is pretty severe, and that's going to limit the abundance of aspen. So that's why I think we'll have an initial increase in aspen due to high disturbance frequency in the early stages of global warming, and then later on the aspen will be knocked out by a combination of drought and wind and succeeding to other species. And we expect the prairie forest border to move north. The prairie forest border, according to our research, I had a PhD student who looked at it, Nick Dons, who's now at the University of Wisconsin-Superior. It essentially sits pretty close to where the precipitation and evapotranspiration balance is zero. So if there's more precipitation than evapotranspiration, you get a forested area, and if there's less precipitation than evaporation, it's a grassland. And that zero balance point is, if you look at global warming scenarios, will move north by about 300 miles, so the little black arrows here. And that will put drought stress on everything, and oak will be far more able to tolerate that level of drought stress than aspen will. And we've already seen some instances of aspen dying a little further west here in the Saskatchewan and Alberta during the really bad droughts around 2010, 11, and 12. Some aspen forests out there did die that were close to the prairie forest border, and this aspen picture here was taken in mid-July, at midsummer. The aspen is dead. It's not a leaf off or an insect-infested stand or anything like that. So drought does have the capability of eventually knocking out aspen, and what will we get? Well, just looking at an analog for northern Minnesota, looking at the blue star here on the lower right, a natural area analog that has a climate similar to what northern Minnesota will have by mid to late century is nice outcrops natural area, which is where the orange star is in southwestern Minnesota. And on rocky terrain like that, this is what you get, oaks and prairie elements kind of mixed together, so more of a savanna type of setting. And I think this will happen on our sandy outwash areas that are scattered throughout northern lower Michigan and northern Wisconsin, as well as the areas that are shallow to bedrock. And then we have the earthworm invasion. We don't have native earthworms in Minnesota, very few in Wisconsin and Michigan, essentially confined to the southern parts of those states. So we have the European earthworms shown here, like the nightcrawler and the Aparectidea there in the lower right. That's what's commonly called angleworms. They're very common in forests throughout the region. All of northern lower Michigan, upper Michigan, northern Wisconsin, and northern Minnesota, almost all of it, probably 90% is infested with these European earthworms. They eat the organic horizon, or the duff layer in the forest, and they compact the mineral soil underneath that, and that leads to more runoff and drier soils, and that puts more drought stress. So the changing climate will have even more drought stress added to it by the worms, and that causes mortality and all sorts of cascading effects for water quality and wildlife that I won't get into. Maybe some other time I can do a whole webinar on worms, but basically when the worms are introduced, the duff is lost there, and that contributes to drought stress and tree seedling death, a higher deer-to-plant ratio, so more death caused by deer. It leads to an increase in Pennsylvania sedge. So you get a lot of forests with lawns of sedge, and tree seedlings have a hard time competing with that. Nitrogen and phosphorus leach out of the system. The soils are warmer and drier, and that all leads to forest dieback and regeneration failure and that's very common in maple forests, but it's also common and happening in aspen forests on mesic soil sites, that when these worms invade, you get dieback in the upper branches and increased drought stress in the trees. So we're seeing it in birch, aspen, and maple forests, all that could be growing on our more mesic soils. So, and then for aspen, there's the fact that earthworms facilitate buckthorn. And I just had a PhD student who's written 3 papers showing that there's a very strong facilitative relationship in both directions between earthworms and buckthorn. And the light levels in aspen stands are such that they can't exclude buckthorn. I mean, buckthorn doesn't do well under dense sugar maple or hemlock, but it does really well under oak and aspen where the shade isn't so dense. And you see here buckthorn. Let me turn the pointer on. I can't see where it went because it's the same color as the vegetation. Oh, there it is. This is buckthorn here, growing under aspen on a rocky site in northern Minnesota. So with the earthworms, I think they'll facilitate buckthorn invasion into aspen stands as if the increasing drought effects and disturbance effects weren't going to be enough. So a lot of things will go wrong for aspen, I think. So to summarize here, aspen fits into the landscape mosaic when we have wind followed by fire or logging followed by fire in the northern hardwoods and in mixed pine, and also after crown fire in the mixed pine. In the boreal forest, it fits into the landscape mosaic after two fires, not 2 firs, 2 fires in a short time, or after wind throw followed by fire. And as far as aspen versus paper birch, we think spring fires give aspen a much bigger advantage than paper birch, and that midsummer to fall fires give a much bigger advantage to the birch, even though there's still a mixture of the other species in there. And in the future, aspen, in a warmer climate, will have these transient dynamics where aspen will do really well for a few decades and then be invaded by red maple, and then probably later on when droughts are really frequent and it's really warm, probably by oak. So there'll be large impacts of windstorms, and aspen again is a very susceptible species, and it's very susceptible to droughts as well. Transition to oak savanna, and then invasive species like earthworms will affect aspen growing on mesic sites, probably facilitate buckthorn invasion and exacerbate drought stress on those mesic sites. And also, when the worms eat the duff, there's no duff there to support fires. So, and without any conifers in the canopy, you can't have either a crown fire or a surface fire if there's just bare mineral soil. So I imagine after all this time, you're tired of listening to me and maybe want to ask some questions.
Well, thanks, Lee. So, folks, remember to take your questions in the chat box. I'll give a few minutes to give you a chance to get those questions in that chat box. And we do have some folks typing. Lee, are you able to see the chat box too?
I can, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it says 2 people are typing right now, so.
Oh, nothing yet.
Multiple people are typing, it says.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe you'll have to point questions out to me. Oh, here we go.
Sure.
How do you predict the impact of change in future aspen will affect red and white pine areas like the BWCA? Well, I think red pine will not fare very well at all in a future warming climate. So the issue is how long will white pine hang around? Well, in northern Minnesota, white pine's close to the northern edge of its range. It'll benefit a little bit from a slightly warmer climate, but if it warms up as much as we think it will, that'll just be transient, and then it'll be too warm and dry for white pine. And so white pine might increase in the boundary waters along with aspen and then make a transition to oak savanna a few decades later, is what I think. And red pine has kind of a bleak future everywhere because not only can it withstand much warmer climates, but it has so many disease problems. Okay, so here's another one. In the 1980s, there were management decisions to change some stands to aspen for industry. Ended up being large areas. Do you account for that at all? Well, the silvicultural regime was purposely changed in order to favor aspen. And a lot of that aspen is on mesic sites, which means, productive sites. They'll be negatively impacted by the earthworm invasion and the increasing drought stress in the future and the increasing windstorm frequency. So I think those aspen stands are good for now. I mean, you might have a problem with them succeeding to red maple or something, depending on what might be invading the understory, but there's going to be a good chance that the earthworm invasion will impact those stands and put them under drought stress, and the productivity won't be as high as you may be used to. Okay, here's another one from Nick J. How does lack of fire and subsequent increase in woody shrubs such as hazel influence your predicted aspen pathways? Well, if you get a lot of those shrubs in the understory, then it requires a disturbance that will knock the shrubs back, just like for red maple. So blowdown followed by fire or some sort of mechanical removal of those shrubs is usually required to get really good, solid regeneration of birch and aspen. So it can affect the pathway in northern Minnesota with a future warmer climate and the trees under drought stress. We could get some areas that become permanent or semi-permanent shrublands because the shrubs are not as sensitive to climate as the trees. So I think shrubs will benefit right along with oak and right along with grasses in a future warmer climate. And I don't think the worms will wipe out those shrubs either. Okay, here's another one. I'm Greg from Seney Wildlife Refuge. Is it appropriate to characterize aspen in disturbed settings to be commonly associated with abundance of biological legacies, down debris, snags, residual trees, and so on? Current management guides taking that into account. I don't think there's a big association for aspen there. My experience is it does pretty well if there aren't a lot of legacies left over. That those legacies are adding diversity to an aspen stand, I think, of plants and insects and fungi and all sorts of things that are important for ecological function. They may turn out in the end to be important for the level of productivity of the stand, but I don't think they're really necessary for aspen reproduction. But as the climate becomes more extreme and more marginal for aspen, that's when those legacies might start actually impacting the regeneration of aspen. Okay, from Chris. What symptoms or early warning signs would you expect to see from climate impacts and from worms? Well, the early warning signs would be unexpected dieback in kind of middle-aged stands, and you wouldn't expect to start seeing dieback up in the crowns when the trees start to feel drought stress from either warming or the worms. You'll see it that way, and you'll also see reduced ring width. Some of our stands where we have a front of earthworm invasion, so we have stands on identical soils with identical history that are partly invaded by worms, we're getting up to a 30% difference in ring width, so a 30% reduction when the earthworms invade. And again, that would be on mesic sites. On sandy and shallow to bedrock sites, probably the drought stress from a warmer climate and longer growing season will be more pronounced, but similar impacts in terms of dieback. Okay, and Tim Miller. What effect will Lake Superior have on climate change predictions for aspen and birch stands near the lake? Boy, do I wish I knew the answer to that. Everywhere where I speak, Tim Miller asks a question that I can't answer. The lake will certainly keep things a little bit cooler. It will limit the magnitude of droughts and future warming, but it's still going to get warmer and drier. The impacts will just be a little bit muted compared to what you would find inland. And I wish I knew the details of what Lake Superior might do in a warmer climate. Some impacts, but somewhat limited. I can tell you during the drought of, I think it was 2006 or 2007, I did see a 30-year-old aspen stand right on the shore of Lake Superior that was dead. But it was growing on a very shallow to bedrock site. So those droughts can affect lakeshore stands, but nowhere near the extent of more inland stands.
Looks like we do have one more person typing in.
Yep.
We'll give them a second or two. Yeah, folks, if you still got questions, go ahead and get them typed in. Well, nothing yet. So I'll start wrapping this up, but feel free, folks, if you got questions, write them in. Again, Lee, huge thank you to you and for everyone online for joining us this afternoon. If you would like to review this webinar or share with someone that might be interested but missed it, I will get a recording of the webinar available on the Lake States Fire Science Consortium webpage later this afternoon, and a PDF is also available on the webpage. Let me switch to the slide here. And so our next webinar is February 16th, 2017. It's going to be common denominators for state-prescribed fires in the Lake States, an overview of state-prescribed fires in the eastern region of the U.S. Forest Service, methods for situational learning. That will be conducted by Steve Goldman with the Forest Service. And it looks like we do have some more questions coming in there, Lee.
Yep, yeah, I can take that first one there about climate projections for more precipitation. Yeah, the projections do show more precipitation for Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. However, we think that the longer growing season and warmer summers, that evaporation will go up more than the increase in precipitation. So it might rain more but be drier. So that's what I think, but that effect will be bigger in Minnesota, not quite as big in Wisconsin, and will be minimal in Michigan because as you go further east, the increase in evaporation probably won't be as much, and Michigan is surrounded by Great Lakes. But there's still going to be some drying just because of a longer growing season. Trees will feel more drought stress. You know, really good comparison for that is to compare the Twin Cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul, with Kansas City. We get an average of 30 inches of rain in the Twin Cities. They get over 40 inches on average in Kansas City, but Kansas City is still drier because the increase in evaporation from longer growing season and warmer summer is makes up for more than the extra 10 inches of rain that they get down there. Let's see here. Or is it primarily periodic droughts that will be worse? Well, that too. So the periodic droughts will be exceptional in a warming climate. So something like we saw in 1976 or in the 1930s, droughts of that magnitude will come more often, so extreme drought events will be more, but it'll be drier on an ongoing basis just because of longer growing seasons and warmer temperatures leading to more evaporation. So I would say both a chronic increase in drought stress and really exceptional extreme droughts.
I don't see any more questions. We can hang on for just a few more minutes, but again, thank you much, Lee. Any final thoughts? We'll wait and see if there's any last questions.
Well, thanks everybody for listening. It's fun to prepare this seminar. I'm going to use it in my class. I'm teaching a class on fire ecology right now, and next week I'm going to be out of town. I'll be able to tell them to look at this webinar. But yeah, aspen has always been a very interesting species because it plays the opposite role to the late successional things like hemlock and maple and balsam fir. So the tension between those two has been a lifelong interest for me.
Excellent. All right. Well, I say without any more questions coming in, we might as well wrap it up. But again, Lee, much appreciated. Big thank you. And thanks everybody online again. I'll be pausing or shutting down the audio and recording.